Hi, my dear friends. Some words of Torah for Parshas Lecha. When two people enter into a contract or make a commitment to each other, this is called a bris or a brit in Hebrew. This word appears multiple times in our Parsha because God entered into two different covenants with Avraham. The first was in a prophetic dream and is called the Brit Bein HaBitarim, the contract between the cut parts. Hashem instructed Avram to take a group of different animals and to cut each into two equal parts and to line the two carcass halves opposite each other, aligning them in such a way that places the incisions facing each other of each carcass, each half carcass. Hashem then showed Avraham a smoke pillar representing God himself, traveling between the two half carcasses, and instructed Avraham to do the same. Walk between the two halves. The second covenant appears at the end of the Parsha when Hashem told Avraham to circumcise himself and his household. This too was a bris, a brit, a covenant. How do we understand these two types of contracts? Why were both necessary? Before we answer this question, let's look at an interesting contrast in covenants between the one made here and the other at the very end of the Torah. Rashi in our Parsha tells us that the Brit Bein HaBitarim was not a unique act. Based on a verse in the book of Yirmiyah, in Jeremiah chapter 34, which describes the Jews of Jeremiah's times as having performed a similar ritual, we see that a mode of making contracts in the ancient world was to cut an animal in half and to walk between the two halves. We find a similar comment in Rashi at the end of the Torah. In Parshat Nitzavim, Moshe tells the Jew that before entering the land of Israel, they must enter into a new covenant with God, wherein they commit to follow the mitzvot in this new frontier. After gathering all the people together, Moshe explained that they were gathered in order la'ovrecha bivrit Hashem Elokecha uva'alato, to pass through a covenant with God. Rashi, in explaining the word la'ovrecha, to pass through, states that it was a standard practice in the ancient world to enter into a covenant by having two parties pass through a pathway that was between two walls. He cites the same passage in Jeremiah of the covenant that was made in Jeremiah's time between two half carcasses of an animal. But instead of describing a covenant between two half carcasses, Rashi instead strangely changes the imagery to two people walking on a path between two walls. Why is that? So to answer all of our questions, I believe that we should first appreciate what is accomplished when making a covenant or a contract. Two parties commit to each other to exchange goods or services such that each party gives something and each party receives something. When I sign a contract to buy your house, I give you money and you give me your house. It's a simple quid pro quo transaction. But there's another kind of covenantal relationship, one that is made between two people who wish to commit to each other in a non-transactional way. The term blood brothers refers to two men who are not related and wish to enter into a commitment to each other to treat each other like they are actual brothers. Usually, this is done through an exchange of blood. It is a commitment of affinity without necessarily guaranteeing any kind of specific exchange in the covenant. It usually means that while I have nothing to offer or take from you at the moment, I promise that when you need me, I'll be there for you and you'll do the same for me. When Hashem first entered into a covenant with Avraham Avinu, he wanted it to represent a blood brothers type of covenant. By taking two halves of an animal carcass and walking through the two halves, we are demonstrating that just as an animal has no life when it is separated in half, the two of us who are entering into this agreement have no real life if we separate from each other. We are as inseparable from each other as the two halves of a whole creature. This was Hashem's effort in showing Avraham that although Avraham would not receive any goods or services in his lifetime for his commitment to Hashem, he could nevertheless rest assured that throughout the duration of Jewish history, Hashem would always be there for his future descendants. God and the Jewish people were now inseparable blood brothers. The covenant of circumcision, of Brit Milah, is the other kind of covenant, which is more of the quid pro quo kind of transactional commitment. Hashem required of Avraham to commit and conscript his future descendants to a life of holiness and service to Hashem. In exchange, Hashem would grant Avraham his great progeny, and he would grant Avraham the land of Israel. This is represented with the Brit Milah, the circumcision. When we encounter other britot in the Torah, most of them are of this kind, this transactional kind. So, for example, when Avraham makes a bris with Avimelech in next week's Parsha, it is a transactional contract that the two parties will commit to peace with each other. Each party gave something. Avraham gave Avimelech 7 sheep, and Avimelech gave Avraham land rights to keep the wells that he had dug. Similarly, when Moshe entered into a covenant for the Jewish people to accept the Torah in the book of Shemot, he calls the Torah itself a Sefer Habrit in Exodus chapter 24, because it represents a transactional contract between God and Israel. But at the most incipient stage of covenants between God and Israel, Hashem first wished to demonstrate that our relationship far transcends any kind of transactional commitment. We are rather committed to each other in a familial way, in a way that transcends any kind of gain that we might attain from each other. Perhaps this is why Rashi changes the analogy at the end of the Torah. Once the unique bond between God and Israel has already been forged with the very first Jew, Avraham, so many centuries before, there was no longer any need to recreate the original covenant of passing between two animal halves. This imagery suggests an essential and natural attachment between the two parties. It's not something that is artificially constructed, but is an act of nature, just like an animal who lives and breathes. But before Bnei Israel would enter into the promised land, Moshe wanted to remind them of this relationship that already existed, and to have the Jewish people recommit to something that was already there. Construct something that reminds you of that which already is part of your essential nature. Proverbially walk through 2 constructed walls to remind yourselves of the inherent closeness and inseparability between yourself and Hashem. This kind of reenactment was necessary before entering the promised land, especially since Bnei Israel would no longer be in such close physical proximity with the Shekhinah as they had been before. It was necessary to recreate that sense of intimacy with Hashem before being released on their own recognizance to build their separate communities in Eretz Yisrael. You know, one of the mistakes that people make in modern society is to mistake a blood brothers covenant with a transactional covenant. If we only commit to our spouses based on what we hope to receive from them, then the marriage is doomed from the start. The same is true of so many other kinds of relationships. If we commit to our religion based solely on what goods or services we hope to receive, then when those goods or services are halted, it's easy to fall away from our religious commitments. Thomas Hobbes argued in his classic work, Leviathan, that every group of people need a social contract where they commit to observe certain laws and strictures of society in exchange for protection and other social benefits. But a much earlier source for the social contract appears in Plato's Republic, in which he is critical of those who abide by social justice purely for the quid pro quo benefit that it provides to them. Rather, there is intrinsic value to living in a covenantal and just society, and only the just man is the truly happy man. What we learn from the Brit Bein HaBitarim is that Hashem first and foremost wishes to have a covenantal relationship that is based on kinship more than an exchange of services. This modeled for Avraham and all of his future progeny that there is intrinsic value in cleaving unto God. That is our first calling, and every other covenantal construct is secondary. So when we are called upon to help our fellow Jew or our religious institutions, We shouldn't be making cost-benefit analyses to determine whether or not we answer that call. We are Hashem's blood brothers, and that's all that matters. And so, dear friends, may our devotion to Hashem and to our fellow man always transcend transactions. May we merit to see the ultimate conjunction between man and God in the Messianic age. May we see it b'mehera b'yameinu, amen. And here's wishing you a wonderful Shabbat. Have a beautiful Shabbat Shalom, dear friends.